Let me take a moment here to introduce myself. I am Professor Tom Dempsey. I am the Chair for National Security Studies at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies and am the faculty lead for our program on security sector reform and transformation in Central Africa. I want to welcome each and every one of you. I have looked forward to this event for a long time, and what we're going to do very briefly this morning, and I appreciate your patience. This is a typical winter day in Washington, D.C., and we are starting a bit late, but we anticipate all of the critical elements of the program will be completed. And of course, the most important part of this program isn't the lunches or even the plenary sessions and the presentations. Most important part of this program is you. Individuals from across Central Africa with real, current, senior level experience in security sector reform who are grappling with these issues yourselves and who, in my experience, tend to be the principal source of the most innovative practices and the most successful solutions where security sector reform is concerned. One of the things I'm going to do over the next 15 minutes or so is talk a little bit about the program to introduce it. And then we are going to transition immediately into our first plenary session, which is focused on state and human security in Central Africa. Normally, our model will be a plenary session in here with all of the participants together, with presenters from the community of practice, from academia, such as our two distinguished presenters with me today, who I will introduce shortly, to offer some thoughts about security sector reform and transformation, and then offer you the opportunity on a non-attribution basis to ask questions and make comments. Those sessions will typically last an hour and a half. Then we'll have a short break, and we will break down into 3 discussion groups, about 12 to 15 individuals each. You'll have 2 ACSS facilitators with each discussion group. And the heart of this program is when we close those doors and you have the opportunity to discuss with each other the critical issues that confront Africa and your subregion in particular in the area of security sector reform and transformation. So I want to start by reviewing program goals and objectives. What is the intent for the next week? And the intent is obviously to review the security landscape in Central Africa. No one is better aware of that landscape than yourselves, and we anticipate that will be a critical component of your discussion. And it's a security landscape that's changing quickly, and accommodating those changes successfully is one of the real challenges for security sector reform and transformation activities today. We hope to give you an opportunity to take stock of and assess security sector reform programs in your own countries, in your subregion, and in Africa as a whole. Discuss how successful those programs are, identify areas where they have perhaps not been as successful, and develop recommendations and ideas for how to better realize the outcomes that security sector reform is designed to achieve. As part of that process, we anticipate that you're going to discuss and review the principles underlying successful SSR. And I think some of the most successful examples of security sector reform and transformation that the world has today are emerging from the continent of Africa. And I think to echo the comments of our acting director referring to former President Mandela, it was his leadership in transforming the security sector of a South Africa that was transitioning to black majority rule that formed much of the impetus for the development of security sector reform, not simply in Africa, but worldwide. And the successes that were realized in the 90s following the transition to black majority rule in South Africa are impressive, and I think still offer us many examples that we can learn from, not least of which is the importance of leadership. We hope to identify and share sound practices from you that can inform and improve ongoing security sector reform efforts in Central Africa and in Africa as a whole. And finally, we look to develop a way forward to more effective national security strategy development and develop concrete steps towards more effective SSR planning and implementation. So that, in a nutshell, is what we hope the next week will accomplish. I want to talk a little bit about program content, but before I do that, I want to go over briefly what you have in the materials that we've provided you. And we're going to begin this morning with state and human security in Central Africa, governance and security challenges. And I'll introduce our two guest speakers shortly and speak a little bit more about that particular session. But this is really to open the debate, to put security sector reform and transformation on the table, and on the table in the context of the security challenges that Central Africa confronts today. Session 2 this afternoon, we will focus on the security sector reform process. We'll drill down a little more deeply into just exactly what security sector reform is. What's the difference between security sector reform and security sector transformation? Is there a difference? We'll talk about who the stakeholders are. We'll examine what those processes look like and give you an opportunity to talk about what that process looks like in Central Africa. Plenary session 4, which will begin, plenary session 3, which will be tomorrow morning, will begin a series of functional sessions focused on different pieces of the security sector. Tomorrow morning, we will focus on reforming the defense and military sectors, and tomorrow afternoon, we will discuss executive and legislative branch oversight. The following day, we will discuss rule of law and justice system reform, and follow that with a discussion of police and law enforcement reform. Then finally, plenary session 7, we will spend discussing gender mainstreaming in security sector reform and the particular challenges of gender-based violence, protection of civilians in a conflict environment. And then we will conclude with plenary session 8, and that actually is going to take up, the preparation for it's going to take up all of Thursday afternoon. And it's useful here to talk a little bit about our model for the coming days. As I said, we'll begin in plenary session here. You'll have an opportunity to listen to some prominent practitioners and academics, to engage in a robust question and answer with them, and then we'll move into our discussion groups. It is our hope that in these discussion groups, you will, over the course of the week, develop some concrete suggestions, recommendations, and observations about security sector reform and transformation. And our intent is that Thursday afternoon, your groups, each discussion group, will identify a spokesperson and will lay out what you think for your discussion group are the most important conclusions that you have drawn from the previous 3.5 days, and the most important recommendations in the area of security sector reform and transformation. And Friday morning, your representative will have an opportunity in about 10 minutes to articulate those major recommendations and observations to the group as a whole before we have our closing ceremony. And that captures, in a nutshell, the intent of this week. It is to give you an opportunity to share with each other your lessons and experience, to explore how we can, as a community of practice, better create the outcomes that security sector reform is supposed to produce, and discuss what those outcomes really ought to be, and identify the lessons that you have learned and will hopefully share with each other. One of the ways that we do that is we provide simultaneous interpretation in English, French, and Portuguese, both here in the plenary session and also in your discussion groups. So you will have an opportunity to have these discussions across language lines. And based on past experiences, as the director mentioned, we had a consultative session last August with several of your colleagues to kind of lay out this roadmap, and that's where most of this program schedule came from. What are the right issues that we need to put on the table? And based on my experience, I am really looking forward to listening to your observations, your suggestions, and your conclusions. There are tremendous lessons in security sector reform that the entire world, in my view, can learn from the experiences in Africa, where security sectors are undergoing fundamental transformation in very, very difficult circumstances and achieving some successes that have, frankly, eluded other sectors, other areas of the world. So my hope is that we will explore some of those in considerable detail. To briefly touch on anticipated outcomes, what do we hope you will walk away from this with? Well, we hope that we will all walk away with an improved understanding of the Central African threat environment. And I have no doubt that that will be the case. Certainly, I will walk away with a better understanding. Since you have a better understanding already of that, hopefully in your deliberations among yourselves, collectively, you will be able to improve your understanding and grasp of the security architecture. An enhanced understanding of the need for security sector reform, the key principles that underpin it, and the key policy, institutional, and capacity gaps in current efforts. What's not going well? What isn't working and why? And how can we make it work better? Articulation of sound practices for the management of the security sector across the sub-region and across Africa as a whole, and lessons, by the way, for security sector reform communities outside Africa. Identification of practical strategies, steps, and measures to improve security sector reform outcomes. And perhaps as important as any of this, the development of a sustainable peer-to-peer network amongst yourselves. And one of the things that our community affairs representatives are going to talk to you about later in the week is the alumni program. Mary McGurn, who is in the back there, is going to be the face of that effort. Step forward here, Mary, so everybody can see you. Don't stand behind the pillars. This is intended to be a vehicle for you to maintain communication with each other, with other security professionals in your own country, and with security professionals in other countries across Africa. One of the things that we all know is that when you have to begin deploying forces to difficult environments, where soldiers are going in harm's way, where civilians are at risk, and many countries are coming together to participate in those efforts, professional networks and relationships of trust and confidence are absolutely critical. The intent of our alumni program is to help you develop and sustain those relationships. There are, I believe, 33 countries across Africa now in which the alumni of ACSS programs have organized themselves into national chapters, sort of like civil society groups, sort of like a professional bar association, where they come together to further develop their professional capabilities, to discuss issues that are of concern to the community as a whole, and to help sustain the momentum that is developed in events not just like this one, but other events where, as security professionals, we are involved in trying to address shortfalls in our own security sectors. And the United States, I should add, has actively pursued security sector reform itself and is continuing to do so today. We're in the midst of a tremendous national debate right now over the nature of our intelligence community and how it should go about collecting information and what it should use it for. So security sector reform is something that everyone is involved with to some degree or another, and our hope is that the alumni program that we will introduce you to later in the week will help you to develop networks of relationships that will help sustain that. And on that note, what I want to do is stop for just a moment. And at this point, normally we stop and introduce all of the ACSS support and facilitators that are going to be involved in the program, but I think what I'm going to do is wait to do that at the end of our next plenary, just before we go into our first discussion group. So at the end of our next plenary after lunch, I will introduce all the facilitators, and I will also introduce all of the ACSS staff. What I want to do is stop for a moment and see if there are any questions about the specific program, about the administrative details, before we transition into our first plenary session. So if I could open the floor, if you have questions on the program schedule, on what the rest of the week looks like. Oh, and I should add, at the conclusion of this first session, we are going to take our official photo. So for those of you who have worn your Class A uniforms, your appropriate dress for that photo, we're going to do that as soon as we wrap up this first session before we go to lunch. So on that note, let me get my headset and ask if there are any questions. Huh? Good. In that case, we will move directly into our first plenary session. State and human security in Central Africa, governance and security challenges. The objectives of this first period that will continue today, and I should add that normally we have a discussion group following this, but unfortunately because of the weather we have had to compress our schedule a little bit, so your first discussion group will be after the second plenary session this afternoon, and I will prevail upon you to remember your thoughts and comments from this first morning session and put them on the table with your facilitators in your small discussion groups at 4 o'clock this afternoon after we conclude the second session. So state and human security in Central Africa, what are we trying to do? Well, obviously we want to assess Central Africa's security environment. We want to look at what the security challenges are, how are they changing, and how do security sectors across Central Africa need to change to respond effectively to them. We're also looking to explore the evolution of the concept of security. Whose security are we talking about? And as part of that, we are going to put on the table a human security model that is a bit different from traditional national security models, which tended to be state-centric and focus on defending the state against invasion by neighboring states. The security debate is shifting today, as I'm sure all of you realize much better than your American counterparts do, to a human security model that is citizen-centric, that is community-based, and that supports democratic governance and focuses on developing effective national and sub-regional security capacity in the context of both traditional security and human security. It explores the parameters of security sector reform and transformation and discusses who the various actors are in the security sector, both state and non-state, both specific to the state and external. What kind of roles do those actors play in the security sector reform process? In the syllabus, as you read through it, as hopefully you will be able to this evening, you can find a discussion of evolving threats and challenges. That is one perspective. What we're really interested in is what you think the evolving threats and challenges are. You'll also find a discussion of transformational SSR. And that begs the question, well, why security sector transformation rather than security sector reform? What does that mean? Why did we include that term? We included that term in the program to capture circumstances which require deep and fundamental change in the security sector. Circumstances where, for example, the security sector is being completely reorganized, as was the case in South Africa after the transition to black majority rule. Circumstances such as the situation in Liberia in 2003, when the security sector had collapsed entirely and had to be reconstructed and reconstituted from the ground up, and had to undertake that in an environment where security players, not simply the non-state actors, but on the state side as well, had lost all legitimacy and functionality. And the Liberians and their partners confronted the challenge of restoring legitimacy and functionality to the security sector. That's what we mean when we talk about transformational reform. There's also a section on the evolving nature of security in Africa that talks in some detail about human security, democracy, and governance. I hope very much tonight that you'll take the time to sit down and read that part of the syllabus and then articulate your thoughts on this whole idea of human security and on the links between security, governance, and democracy. This is about your perceptions, your experiences, and your judgment of what security sector reform is and ought to be in and for Central Africa. And finally, the syllabus takes some time to lay out some definitions of security sector reform. And I particularly want to recommend to you one of the readings. It's the first reading that you have. It's called Security Sector Governance in Africa, a Handbook. It's a relatively short reading, only about 8 pages. And I strongly encourage you to sit down and read through this tonight. The readings are translated into all 3 languages. For those of you who are Francophone partners, should have it in French. From Sao Tome and Angola, it should be in Portuguese. If it's in the wrong language, please let us know, and we'll get you the readings in the correct language. But I heartily encourage you to read this one tonight, as it is an excellent introduction to what we're going to be talking about for the next 5 days. And I would add, okay, this is what they think. Now, Nicole Ball and Kayode Fayemi, some of you may know them, certainly have a lot of experience. I respect them tremendously. Fascinating people. They are not practitioners. And so one of the things that I would charge you is to take a look at what they're offering with a skeptical eye and assess whether this is in fact meeting your needs. Is this the right interpretation? Is it useful? If it's not useful, why not? What parts of it do you find ring true to you? What parts of it do you read and say, well, you know, I really don't think that's quite right. So again, the purpose of the syllabus and the materials is to provoke thought and questioning and discussion, and we hope that is what they will do. And on that note, I want to introduce our first 2 speakers. We are extraordinarily fortunate to have 2 individuals who have been deeply involved in security issues in Central Africa. Our first speaker will be Thierry Vercoulon from the International Crisis Group. He is the project director for Central Africa. He holds a master's degree in political science from Sorbonne University. He lived and worked in South Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo and is now based in Nairobi, Kenya. After a 15-year career in the civil service, he joined International Crisis Group, which I'm sure most, if not all of you, are familiar with, and he currently works on conflict and risk analysis in Central Africa. He's been part of several groups of experts working extensively on SSR issues for the Organization for OECD, the United Nations, and the African Union. Presently, his work focuses on the rise of maritime insecurity in the Gulf of Guinea and the Central African Republic crisis. He is being consulted by very, very senior policy leaders this week in the United States to try and inform our decisions about how we can best support the ongoing efforts to address the challenges in the Central African Republic. Vemba Dizolele is a writer, foreign policy analyst, and independent journalist. He was a grantee of the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting and covered the 2006 historic elections in the Democratic Republic of Congo. With the Pulitzer Center, he produced Congo's Bloody Coltan, a documentary report on the relation between the Congo conflict and the scramble for mineral resources. He served as an election monitor with the Carter Center in the runoff between Joseph Kabila and Jean-Pierre Bemba. He was also embedded with the United Nations peacekeepers in Congo's war-torn Ituri and South Kivu provinces as a reporter. He returned to DRC in 2011 to observe the controversial presidential and legislative elections, again with the Carter Center, and holds an International Master of Business Administration and a Master of Public Policy from the University of Chicago. I think we could not ask for two individuals better suited to open this discussion of human security challenges in Central Africa.